In the land between the lakes, a predator made a fatal error. It chose a victim who was ready for war. Something ancient. Something calculating. And once the curse takes hold, there is no turning back. Willie Brown woke up from a deep, dreamless sleep just after 3:00 a.m., though he couldn't immediately explain why. The air in the cabin felt wrong, heavy, still, and suffocatingly quiet. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his 71-year-old heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. The land between the lakes was never truly silent. The Kentucky woodlands usually hummed with the friction of crickets, the call of owls, or the wind rustling through the oaks. But tonight there was no wind, no insects, and no birds, just a vacuum of absolute silence. He threw off the quilt and swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. He walked to the window facing the tree line and peered through the blinds, his pale blue eyes adjusting to the darkness. Nothing moved. The stillness was unnatural, pressing against the glass like a physical weight. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, drawing a deep breath of the mountain air. It hit him instantly, something sharp and sour assaulting his nose. It was the scent of blood, not fresh, perhaps a day old, but potent enough to raise the hair on his arms. Willie didn't panic, he simply hardened. He turned back inside, grabbed his rifle, a .30-30 Winchester he kept polished and loaded, and stepped off the porch. The dirt trail leading to the edge of the woods was only about 70 feet long, but in the oppressive dark, it felt miles longer. Willie moved slowly, his boots crunching softly over the dry leaves and pine needles, his eyes scanning the shadows. He held the rifle tight against his shoulder, a habit born from years in Vietnam and decades as a county sheriff. Then he saw it. At the base of a large oak tree, something lay crumpled in the dirt. Willie crouched, shining his flashlight on the shape. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The animal had been torn open, half its rib cage missing, but the violence wasn't clean like that of a cougar or a bear. The lungs were gone, ripped out with terrifying precision, yet the head remained intact, except for the eyes, which were missing. Willie straightened up, his stomach twisting. He took a step back, the beam of his light sweeping the ground. That was when he saw the prints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, bare feet massive, at least a size 15. But the toes were wrong. They were too long, elongated, and digging into the soil. The shape of the heel was off, looking like something trapped halfway between a human and an animal. He followed the trail for about 15 feet before it simply vanished into the dense brush, as if the thing had dissolved into the night. Willie stood alone in the silence, the smell of copper and musk filling his lungs. He gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white. This was no poacher, and it was no bear. The woods were holding a secret, and for the first time in years, Willie Brown felt the cold touch of true predatory dread. The morning sun burned off the mist clinging to the Kentucky hills, but it couldn't touch the cold knot tightening in Willie Brown's stomach. He hadn't slept since finding the deer, spending the remaining hours of darkness in his armchair with the Winchester resting across his lap, watching the tree line through the window. By noon, the silence of the woods was broken, not by the return of birdsong, but by the wail of sirens echoing off the lakes. The news traveled through the county with the speed of a brushfire. Edna Yost, a 19-year-old hiker known for her bright smile and love for the backcountry trails, had been found dead just 4 miles north of Willie's cabin. She hadn't just fallen, and she hadn't been attacked by a stray dog. The reports that crackled over the old police scanner Willie kept on his kitchen table were fragmented, panicked, and filled with codes that hadn't been used in years. Willie drove his rusted pickup down the gravel road toward the trailhead, stopping where the deputies had taped off the perimeter. He didn't cross the line. He didn't have the badge for that anymore, but he didn't have to. He saw the faces of the young officers, pale and green around the gills. He saw Sheriff Dana Cordell stepping out of the brush, her jaw set hard, looking like she'd just seen hell itself. When their eyes met, she gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. Later, the details reached him through the whispers at the gas station and the terrified silence of the locals. Edna had been torn open. It wasn't the messy, desperate mauling of a bear protecting its cubs or the calculated strike of a cougar. Her rib cage had been cracked open like brittle firewood, and her throat had been crushed. But the most disturbing detail, the one that made the old veterans look away, was the lack of feeding. The predator hadn't eaten her, it had destroyed her. It was violence for the sake of violence. Willie returned to his cabin as the sun began to dip behind the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows across his yard. He locked the heavy oak door and checked the windows, a ritual he hadn't felt the need to perform since his days in uniform. The woods felt different now. They weren't just quiet, they were watching. He sat on the porch as twilight bled into night, a mug of black coffee in one hand and his rifle in the other. He wasn't waiting for the police to solve this. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like frost, that the law couldn't handcuff what was out there. Around 10:00 p.m. the wind shifted. The smell returned, that same musk, heavy with the copper tang of old blood and wet soil. Willie set his coffee down. He didn't move fast. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who knew that sudden movements triggered instincts in wild things. He raised the rifle, peering into the gloom of his backyard. Near the tool shed, about 40 yards from the porch, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was too tall to be a man, and too broad to be a bear standing on its hind legs. The silhouette was long shoulders that hunched forward with unnatural mass, limbs that looked stretched and wiry. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace that defied its size, sliding around the corner of the shed. Willie stood up, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the wooden deck. He wanted it to hear him. "Get out of here," Willie yelled, his voice cracking like a whip across the yard. The shape stopped. It didn't flinch. It didn't scramble for cover like a coyote caught in headlights. It simply turned. Even from this distance, Willie could feel the weight of its gaze. 2 points of faint, amber light reflected the moon. It stood fully upright, towering over the structure of the shed. Willie shouldered the Winchester. He aimed high, well above the creature's head, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The gunshot shattered the silence, the muzzle flash illuminating the yard for a split second. The bullet tore through the siding of the shed, sending splinters flying. In the ringing silence that followed, Willie expected the thing to bolt. He waited for the crash of brush, the sound of a panicked retreat. But there was nothing. The creature hadn't moved. It stood perfectly still, its head cocked slightly to the side, as if analyzing the sound, the trajectory, and the man who had fired it. It wasn't afraid. It was curious. Then the creature stepped forward, moving out of the shadow of the shed and into the pale wash of moonlight. Willie's breath hitched. It was a nightmare made of muscle and patchy fur, its arms hanging low, ending in hands that were terrifyingly dexterous. It looked directly at Willie, its lips peeling back not in a snarl, but in something that looked disturbingly like a smile. It was studying him, measuring his fear against his aggression. For a long heartbeat, man and monster locked eyes across the yard. Then, with a casual, almost dismissive turn, the beast dropped to all fours and melted back into the tree line, making no more noise than a passing ghost. Willie remained on the porch, the rifle trembling slightly in his hands, realizing with a sinking dread that the warning shot hadn't been a deterrent. It had been an invitation. 2 nights later, the silence broke again, but this time it wasn't the absence of sound that chilled Willie Brown's blood. It was the noise of destruction. It started as a metallic screech, the sound of corrugated steel being ripped from its rivets, echoing from down the valley. Willie knew that sound. It was coming from the property of Mickle Rogers, the local mechanic who lived a quarter-mile down the gravel access road. Mickle was a good man, a quiet soul who kept the county's aging tractors and trucks running with grease-stained hands and infinite patience. Willie didn't wait. He grabbed the Winchester and his keys, jumping into his truck. He didn't turn on the headlights. He navigated the winding dirt path by the pale wash of the moon and memory alone, the tires crunching over the gravel. When he rounded the final bend toward Mikkel's garage, he killed the engine and let the truck drift to a silent halt. The garage door, a heavy sheet of reinforced steel, had been peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. Inside, the single hanging bulb flickered erratically, casting spastic shadows against the walls. Willie moved toward the opening, the smell of gasoline mixing with that now familiar copper stench of slaughter. "Mikkel," Willie whispered, though he knew there would be no answer. He stepped over the threshold, rifle raised. In the center of the garage, amidst scattered wrenches and spilled oil, the creature crouched. It was massive, its spine pressing against the rafters as it hunched over something on the floor. It wasn't just killing, it was feeding. The wet, tearing sounds were nauseating, rhythmic and wet. Willie's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on the mechanic's boot. Mikkel was gone, his body a ruin of torn flannel and devastating injury. The creature froze as the light hit its fur. It didn't bolt. It slowly turned its head, raw meat hanging from its jaws, its golden eyes narrowing as they recognized the old sheriff. Rage, hot and white, flooded Willie's chest. This wasn't hunting. This was desecration. "Get away from him," Willie roared, abandoning stealth for fury. He fired. The bullet sparked off the concrete floor inches from the beast's claw as the creature moved with impossible speed. It didn't retreat this time. It launched itself off the back wall, using the momentum to close the distance between them in a blur of black fur and muscle. Willie racked the lever, chambering another silver-tipped round, but the beast was already on him. It didn't go for the throat. It swiped out with a long, heavy arm, almost casually. The blow knocked the rifle barrel aside and caught Willie on the left forearm. The pain was instantaneous and searing, like being lashed with a whip made of ice and fire. Willie stumbled back, crashing into a tool bench. Tools clattered to the floor in a cacophony of steel. He gasped, clutching his arm, but kept his eyes on the monster. The creature landed on all fours near the door. It looked at Willie, then at the blood dripping from his arm onto the concrete. It let out a low, vibrating chuff, a sound that sounded mockingly like a laugh, and then turned, bounding out into the night, leaving Mikkel's remains and the wounded sheriff behind. Willie didn't pursue. He couldn't. His arm was on fire. He scrambled to his feet, checking the perimeter to ensure the devil was truly gone, then knelt by Mikkel. There was nothing to be done for the mechanic. Willie closed his eyes for a second, offering a silent prayer to a god that felt very far away, then used his good hand to pull a tarp over his friend's body. He wouldn't leave him exposed. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of adrenaline and agony. By the time Willie stumbled into his kitchen, his jacket sleeve was soaked dark red. He stripped off the coat and the flannel shirt beneath, his breath hissing through his teeth. The wound wasn't deep enough to sever the muscle, but it was ugly. 3 parallel gashes ran from his elbow to his wrist. The flesh around the cuts was already turning a bruised, angry purple, and the blood oozing from them looked too dark, almost black in the harsh light of the kitchen. But it was the sensation that scared him most. It didn't throb like a normal injury. It hummed. It felt as if something was moving under the skin, burrowing deeper into his marrow. "Damn it," Willie muttered, his hands shaking as he reached for the bottle of whiskey on the counter. He took a long pull, the burn of the alcohol grounding him, then poured the rest over the wound. He didn't scream, but a guttural groan escaped his throat as the alcohol washed away the blood. He lit the gas burner on his stove and pulled a hunting knife from his belt. He held the blade over the blue flame until the steel turned a dull, glowing red. He had seen men die from infection in the jungle, rot that started small and consumed a limb in days. He wouldn't let that happen here. Gritting his teeth around a leather belt, Willie pressed the flat of the searing blade against the gashes. The smell of his own burning flesh filled the small kitchen, acrid and sweet. His vision swam, gray spots dancing at the edges of his sight, but he held the metal down until the skin sizzled and fused. He dropped the knife into the sink with a clatter and slumped against the counter, sweat pouring down his face, gasping for air. He waited for the pain to subside into a dull ache, for the burn to do its work. He looked down at his arm, expecting to see the angry red of a cauterized wound. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The heat had sealed the skin, but beneath the burns the purple discoloration hadn't faded. It was spreading. Dark, spiderweb veins were creeping out from the cauterized tissue, inching up his bicep like ink spilled in water. They pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a erratic, forceful rhythm that felt alien to his own body. Willie touched the skin above the burn. It was fever-hot. The infection hadn't waited for bacteria or time. It was immediate, aggressive, and alive. He stared at the black lines crawling toward his shoulder, realizing with a sinking dread that fire hadn't killed it. It was already in his blood. The dream did not feel like a dream. It felt like a memory of a life Willie Brown had never lived. He was no longer 71 years old. He was no longer burdened by the ache in his knees or the stiffness in his lower back. He was fluid, powerful, and terrifyingly fast. The ground rushed beneath him, a blur of dirt and clover, passing in a rhythmic thump of paws striking earth. He wasn't running on two legs. He was galloping on four, his center of gravity low, his chest filled with the cold night air. The woods of the land between the lakes, usually a place of silent navigation, were now an explosion of sensory data. He could smell the sap in the pines, the rot of a fallen log a mile away, and most intoxicating of all, the warm, musky scent of a heifer in a nearby pasture. The hunger in his belly wasn't a hollow ache. It was a driving engine, a furnace demanding fuel. He cleared a barbed wire fence with a leap that defied gravity, landing silently in the grass. The cow didn't even raise its head until he was already upon it, jaws snapping shut with the force of a hydraulic press. The hot copper taste of blood flooded his mouth, sweeter than wine, warmer than whiskey. Willie woke with a gasp, his body jerking upright in bed as if he had been defibrillated. The cabin was dark, but the air around him felt stiflingly hot. His sheets were soaked through with sweat, clinging to his skin like a shroud. For a moment he sat there, chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran his tongue over his teeth. There was no blood, only the stale taste of a dry mouth, but the phantom sensation of tearing flesh lingered, making his stomach cramp with a confused mix of nausea and desire. He threw the covers off and stumbled toward the bathroom. His equilibrium was shot. The room seemed to tilt on an axis. He gripped the porcelain sink to steady himself, staring into the mirror. The face looking back was his, the same gray beard, the same weathered lines, but his eyes were bloodshot and frantic, the pupils dilated so wide the pale blue irises were merely thin rings. His left arm throbbed. It wasn't the sharp sting of the burn he had inflicted on himself 2 nights ago. It was a deep, pressurized ache, like a tooth needing to be pulled. Willie looked down at the wound. He had cauterized the 3 claw marks, sealing the skin with red-hot steel to keep the infection out. But the infection hadn't come from the outside. The burned scab, which should have been a solid, lifeless crust, was cracking. Pushing up through the charred tissue were coarse, black hairs. They didn't look human. They were thick as wire, curled and rigid, sprouting directly from the healing flesh like weeds breaking through pavement. Willie grabbed a pair of tweezers from the cabinet, his hands shaking violently. He clamped the metal onto one of the black bristles and pulled. He expected a pinch. Instead, a jolt of agony shot up his arm, connecting deep into his nerve endings. He dropped the tweezers with a curse. The hair was rooted deep, anchored into the muscle itself. He looked at his hand, the hand that had held a badge for 30 years, the hand that had just dropped the tweezers. The fingernails looked wrong. They were yellowing, thickening at the base. The curve of the nail on his index finger had sharpened, the keratin growing dense and pointed, looking less like a man's hand and more like a talon. A wave of dizziness hit him, and he gripped the counter again. The hunger returned, sudden and violent. It wasn't a desire for food. It was a biological imperative, a screaming demand from his cells. His body was burning calories at an impossible rate, fueling whatever mutation was rewriting his DNA. He stumbled into the kitchen. His hands were shaking so bad he could hear his bones rattling. He opened the pantry, tearing open a box of crackers, shoving them into his mouth. They tasted like sawdust. He tried a piece of bread. It felt like ash. His stomach revolted, heaving dryly. The food wasn't right. It wasn't what the machine needed. Then his eyes drifted to the refrigerator, specifically the freezer compartment. Willie froze. He knew what was in there. He knew what he wanted. The rational part of his brain, the part that was still Sheriff Willie Brown, screamed in protest. "You are a man," it whispered. "You are a child of God." But the thing in his blood screamed louder. "You are starving." He walked to the fridge, his movements jerky and puppet-like. He opened the freezer door. The cold air rolled out, hitting his fevered skin with blissful relief. Inside, wrapped in white butcher paper, were cuts of venison from a buck he'd taken last season. He reached in, his thickened fingernails tearing through the paper. He pulled out a frozen steak, hard as a rock. It wasn't enough. He needed the thaw. He needed the softness. He tossed it into the microwave, hitting the defrost button with a trembling finger. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the cabin. Willie stood there, gripping the counter, saliva flooding his mouth. The seconds ticked by like hours. When the ding sounded, he didn't wait. He pulled the meat out. It was still cold in the center, raw and red, glistening with moisture. The smell hit him, raw protein, iron, blood. To any other man, it would have been repulsive. To Willie in that moment, it was the most beautiful scent on earth. He didn't grab a fork. He didn't grab a knife. He picked up the slab of venison with his bare hands. He hesitated for one final second, looking at the raw flesh, looking at his mutated hand holding it. A tear leaked from his eye, hot and shameful. "God help me," he whispered. Then he bit down. The relief was instantaneous. As he chewed and swallowed the raw meat, the shaking in his hands stopped, the fever cooling in his veins. The pounding in his head slowed to a rhythmic, satisfied thrum. He ate with a terrifying efficiency, tearing through the muscle and sinew, ignoring the cold, ignoring the humanity he was swallowing along with it. When he finished, he stood in the dark kitchen, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked down at his arm. The black veins seemed to pulse a little slower, satisfied. Willie Brown leaned against the refrigerator and slid down to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest, listening to the silence of the house, and knowing with a terrifying certainty that the man he had been yesterday was dying and something else was being born in his place. The knocking on the door didn't startle Willie Brown, but the scent that drifted through the cracks in the wood did. It wasn't the musk of the beast or the copper tang of blood. It was vanilla car air freshener and gun oil. He knew who it was before he even lifted the heavy oak latch. Sheriff Dana Cordell stood on the porch, her knuckles poised to rap on the wood again. She looked tired. The dark circles under her hazel eyes spoke of sleepless nights and a county rapidly losing its grip on sanity. But when the door swung open and she saw Willie, her exhaustion was momentarily replaced by shock. Willie knew what she was seeing. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. His skin was pale and clammy, slick with a fever sweat that wouldn't break, yet he was wearing a heavy flannel shirt buttoned to the wrists despite the midday warmth. He leaned heavily on the doorframe, trying to keep his left arm hidden behind the wood, the black veins beneath the sleeve pulsing with a rhythm that made his teeth ache. "You look like hell, Willie," Dana said, her voice tight. "Flu," Willie lied, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "Been going around." Dana didn't buy it. She stepped past him without asking, walking into the dim living room. She took in the drawn blinds, the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter, and the distinct, coppery smell of raw meat that lingered in the air from his earlier, shameful meal. She turned to face him, crossing her arms over her uniform. "We found Mickle Rogers," she said. or what was left of him, and the coroner is saying the same thing he said about Edna Yost. No bear tracks, no cougar sign, just brute force. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. I found tire tracks near Mickle's garage, Willie, your tread pattern. Willie closed the door, shutting out the light. I heard a noise, went to check, I was too late. And you didn't call it in. Dana's voice rose, cracking with frustration. I have a town full of people buying padlocks and sleeping with shotguns. Dennis Ross told me you came into his shop yesterday and bought enough silver-tipped rounds to start a small war. Now you're hiding in the dark. Talk to me, Willie. What are we dealing with? Willie gripped the back of his armchair, his thickened fingernails digging into the upholstery. He couldn't tell her. She wouldn't believe him, and if she did, she'd try to stop it. She'd get herself killed. It's not an animal, Dana, Willie said softly. Not when you can catch with a trap line. You need to tell folks to stay inside. Curfew. Sundown to sunup. No exceptions. Is that what you're doing? Staying inside? She stepped closer, her gaze dropping to his left hand, which was trembling. What happened to your arm? Willie pulled his hand back instinctively. Accident with the wood splitter. I'm fine. Let me see it. Go home, Dana. The growl in his voice wasn't entirely human. It rumbled deep in his chest, a subsonic vibration that made the hair on Dana's neck stand up. She froze, her hand hovering near her service weapon, not out of aggression, but out of sudden, instinctual fear. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the mentor she had known for 20 years, and finding a stranger staring back with dilated, feverish pupils. I'm doubling patrols, she said quietly, backing toward the door. If you know something and you're not telling me, that blood is on your hands, Sheriff. She left, the door clicking shut behind her. Willie listened to her cruiser crunch down the gravel driveway, the sound fading into the silence of the woods. He slumped into the chair, clutching his burning arm. She was right. The blood was on his hands, and soon there would be more. Night fell heavy and fast, bringing the suffocating silence back to the land between the lakes. Willie sat in the dark, the fever spiking. The hunger was clawing at his belly again, but he refused to go back to the freezer. He wouldn't feed the thing inside him tonight. At 11:42 p.m., the motion sensor light above the front porch flickered on. Willie was out of the chair instantly, the Winchester raised. He hadn't heard an approach. No crunch of leaves, no engine, no footfalls, just the click of the light relay. He moved to the window, peering through the slat in the blinds. The porch was empty. Then something hit the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a wet, heavy thud, like a sack of wet cement being thrown against the wood. The door rattled in its frame. Willie backed up, leveling the rifle at the center of the door. I'm armed, he shouted, though he knew the warning was useless. Silence followed. No growl, no footsteps, just the humming of the refrigerator and the pounding of his own heart. He waited for a minute, then two. The tension stretched until it felt like a physical wire tightening around his throat. He had to know. Willie moved to the door, unlocked the deadbolt with a metallic clack, and kicked it open, stepping back immediately with the rifle shouldered. The porch was empty of monsters, but it wasn't empty. Lying on the doormat, staring up at the porch light with glazed, terrified eyes, was the severed head of Dennis Ross. Willie lowered the rifle, bile rising in his throat. Dennis, the ammo shop owner, a loud, boisterous man who had sold Willie the silver rounds just yesterday, joking about werewolves and vampires. His body lay in a heap at the bottom of the porch steps, twisted and broken like a discarded doll. His chest had been hollowed out, ribs snapped outward, but it was the arrangement that froze Willie's blood. Dennis hadn't been killed here. There was no blood spray on the porch, no struggle marks in the dirt. He had been hunted down in town, killed, and dragged miles through the woods to be dumped on Willie's doorstep. Willie stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The darkness was absolute, but his changing eyes caught movement. a shadow shifting between the oaks at the edge of his property. The Alpha stood there just beyond the reach of the floodlight. It wasn't hiding. It was standing tall, 7 feet of nightmare watching him. It raised a clawed hand, pointing first at the ruin of Dennis Ross and then at Willie. The message was clear. There were no safe places. There were no silver bullets that could save them. The beast knew who Willie was, it knew who his allies were, and it was going to pick them apart, piece by piece, until Willie broke. As the Alpha dissolved back into the shadows, Willie looked down at his friend's remains. He didn't feel fear anymore. The shock burned away, replaced by a cold, hollow resolve. The creature wanted a war. It was going to get one. Willie dragged Dennis's body inside and locked the door. Tonight, the sheriff was dead. The hunter was all that was left. Willie Brown stood over the tarp-covered mound in his living room, the silence of the cabin now amplified by the presence of the dead. Dennis Ross had been a loud man, full of bad jokes and boisterous laughter, but now he was just a heap of cooling flesh on the floorboards. Willie's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the fever raging beneath his skin. He looked at his left arm. The black veins had crept past his elbow, tracing a poisoned map toward his heart. The hunger in his belly was a dull, persistent roar, demanding he tear into the very corpse he was trying to respect. He dry-heaved, stumbling back against the wall. He was losing. The Alpha knew where he lived. It knew his friends. It knew he was turning. Willie realized with a sinking, cold clarity that he couldn't hold this siege alone. He was one old man with a bolt-action rifle and a rotting soul, fighting a primordial force that had likely stalked these woods since before the treaties were signed. He needed an army, but all he had was a radio he couldn't use and a town he couldn't protect. Then the gravel in his driveway crunched. It wasn't the stealthy approach of the beast. It was the heavy, rhythmic roll of tires, followed by the low idle of a diesel engine that sounded like it was gargling rocks. Willie grabbed the Winchester, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He didn't turn on the porch light. He moved to the window, peering through the slat. A battered Ford truck, painted a matte primer gray and lifted high on mud tires, sat idling in the dark. The headlights were off. The driver's side door creaked open, and a boot hit the dirt. Willie racked the lever of his rifle. He cracked the front door open just an inch. "State your business," he barked, his voice ragged, "or turn around before I put a hole in your radiator." The figure standing by the truck didn't flinch. He was a mountain of a man, silhouetted against the weak starlight, wearing a canvas duster that looked stiff with age and grime. He took a slow drag from a cigarette, the cherry glowing bright orange, then flicked it into a puddle. "Smells like a slaughterhouse in there, Sheriff," the stranger called out. His voice was deep, scraping like gravel mixer. "And you smell like something that's been dead for 3 days." Willie hesitated. The man wasn't panicked, he wasn't aggressive. He sounded resigned. "Who are you?" Willie asked, keeping the barrel trained on the man's chest. "Name's Alfred Johnson," the stranger said, stepping toward the light. "And if you pull that trigger, you're gonna be the only thing standing between this town and the devil. I reckon you ain't in no condition to fight a war by yourself." Willie lowered the rifle slightly. He had heard the name. Alfred Johnson was a ghost story among the Rangers, a decorated vet who had gone off-grid in the 90s, rumored to be hunting poachers or running shine. Some folks said he was crazy. Others said he was the only reason campers stopped disappearing in the south end of the park. "Come in," Willie said, stepping back. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em." Alfred walked up the porch steps, stepping over the bloodstain where Dennis had lain without pausing. He entered the cabin, his eyes immediately darting to the tarp on the floor, then snapping to Willie. Under the harsh kitchen light, Alfred looked like a road map of violence. A jagged, keloid scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent, grim sneer. His head was shaved, revealing more scars crisscrossing his scalp. But it was his eyes that stopped Willie cold. They were yellow hazel, bright and watchful, and they held the same predatory glint that Willie saw in the mirror every morning. Alfred didn't say a word. He walked straight to Willie, reached out with a hand the size of a catcher's mitt, and grabbed Willie's left arm. Willie snarled, a guttural animal sound that he couldn't suppress, and tried to jerk away. Alfred didn't budge. He shoved Willie's sleeve up, exposing the black, pulsing veins and the coarse hair sprouting from the cauterized wound. "Clean cut," Alfred muttered, inspecting the infection. "But you waited too long on the burn. It's in the marrow now." "Get off me," Willie growled, shoving the big man back. "I know what it is." "Do you?" Alfred crossed the room and sat at the kitchen table, the wood groaning under his weight. He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver flask. He took a swig and slid it across the table to Willie. "It ain't rabies, Sheriff, and it ain't a virus. It's a draft card." Willie stared at the flask, then at Alfred. "What are you talking about?" "The alpha," Alfred said, leaning forward. "The big one. The one with the gold eyes that likes to smile before he kills." Willie nodded slowly. "He ain't just eating folks," Alfred continued. "If he wanted food, he'd stick to the elk. If he wanted to kill you, you'd be dead in that shed 3 nights ago. He's ancient, Willie. He's smart. And he's lonely." Alfred unbuttoned the cuff of his own heavy coat and rolled up his sleeve. Willie's breath hitched. Alfred's arm was a ruin of scar tissue, bite marks and burned scars that looked decades old. But beneath the mangled skin, Willie saw the faint, dark trace of black veins, dormant, but there. "I caught a stray tooth back in 04, Alfred said quietly. "Fought it off, kept my mind. Most don't. Most turn into those runner dogs, the fast ones, the dumb ones, but you," Alfred pointed a calloused finger at Willie. "You didn't turn into a runner, you're fighting it, you're angry, you're strong." "He killed Dennis to send a message," Willie said, his voice hollow. "No," Alfred corrected. "He killed the ammo man to cut off your supply. He killed the mechanic to isolate you. He's stripping you naked, Sheriff. He wants you desperate. He wants you to realize that the only way you survive is to give in." "To what?" "To the pack," Alfred said grimly. "He's looking for a lieutenant, a general to lead the runts. He wants someone who knows how to hunt, someone who knows the terrain. He wants you, Willie. He wants you to stand at his right hand and burn this whole county to the ground." Willie looked at the gun on the table, then at the monster growing in his own blood. The horror of it washed over him. He wasn't just prey, he was the heir apparent. "I won't do it," Willie whispered. "I'll put a bullet in my brain first." Alfred stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the room. He picked up the flask and took another drink. "Maybe, or maybe we use that anger. Maybe we take the fight to him before you lose the keys to the truck." He looked Willie dead in the eye, a soldier acknowledging another on the eve of a suicide mission. "You're turning, Willie. There's no stopping that train. But as long as you've got your hands on the wheel, we've got a chance to kill the conductor. But we move tonight. Tomorrow, you might not be Willie Brown anymore." The drive to the water's edge was performed in a silence heavier than the humid Kentucky air. Alfred drove his battered truck, the suspension groaning as they navigated the washed-out logging roads deep in the heart of the land between the lakes. Willie sat in the passenger seat, his head leaning against the cool glass, his eyes closed. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening to the engine of the truck, to the heartbeat of the woods, and to the terrified, rapid pulse of Sheriff Dana Cordell in the back seat. He could smell her fear. It wasn't poetic. It was chemical, acidic, and sharp, cutting through the scent of diesel and mud. It made the thing inside him restless, prickling at the base of his skull. "Turn here," Willie rasped, his eyes snapping open. He pointed a trembling hand toward a dense thicket of briars that looked impassable. "There's no road there, Willie," Dana said, leaning forward, her hand resting on the back of his seat. "Not for us," Willie replied, his voice vibrating with a low, inhuman timbre. "For them." Alfred didn't question it. He jerked the wheel, crushing saplings beneath the massive tires. They rolled for another half-mile before the ground turned soft and the smell of standing water filled the cab. Alfred killed the engine. On foot from here, the big hunter grunted, grabbing a long, silver-tipped pike from the gun rack and a machete that looked like it had seen wars on 2 continents. Caves are about 400 yards north. Limestone system right on the waterline. Good cover. One way in, one way out. They stepped out into the dark. The moon was hidden behind a shroud of clouds, but to Willie, the forest was painted in shades of gray and vibrant, heat-signature red. He could see the warmth fatting from the truck's hood. He could see the raccoons watching from the canopy. "Stay close," Willie commanded. He didn't wait for Dana's acknowledgement. He took point, moving with a speed and silence that a 71-year-old man with bad knees shouldn't possess. The terrain dropped sharply toward the lake. The smell hit them before they saw the water, the stench of wet fur, rotting meat, and excrement. It was the den. Willie's lip curled back involuntarily, a growl building in his throat. He felt the hunger spike, but this time it was mixed with a territorial rage. This was his county. These were intruders. "Lights off," Alfred whispered to Dana. "Willie's got the eyes." They crept along the limestone bluffs. Below, the black water of the lake lapped against the rocks. Ahead, a dark maw opened in the cliff face, a cave entrance half submerged in shadow. Willie stopped dead. The hair on his arm stood up, pushing against the fabric of his flannel shirt. The wind shifted. "Trap," Willie hissed. It happened in a blur. From the ridges above the cave and the dense brush to their right, shapes exploded into motion. These weren't the alpha. They were smaller, leaner, mangled things of patch fur and madness. The runners, Alfred had called them. Beta wolves who had lost their minds to the curse, serving only as teeth and claws for the master. 3 of them hit the ground in front of the group, snarling with a sound like tearing metal. "Contact," Alfred roared, swinging his pike. The silver tip caught the first wolf in the shoulder, stopping its charge with a wet crunch. The beast shrieked, thrashing as Alfred booted it back. Dana raised her service pistol, firing into the dark. The muzzle flashes were blinding strobe lights in the gloom. Bang, bang, bang. One of the wolves yelped, spinning away, but another launched itself from the rocks, aiming for her throat. Willie didn't think. He didn't raise his Winchester. The rifle felt clumsy, a tool for a man who needed distance. He didn't need distance anymore. He dropped the gun and lunged. He collided with the wolf in midair, catching it just inches from Dana's face. The impact was seismic. Willie slammed the creature into the limestone wall, the force cracking the rock. The wolf, 150 pounds of muscle and hate, snapped its jaws at Willie's face, its claws raking across his chest. Willie didn't feel the pain, he felt the power. He roared, a sound that drowned out the gunfire, a sound that belonged to the alpha's bloodline. His hands, now thickened and tipped with hardened, talon-like nails, gripped the wolf's throat. The creature's eyes went wide, shifting from predatory rage to sudden, primal panic. It realized too late that it wasn't fighting a man. Willie squeezed. There was a sickening pop, followed by the wet crunch of a collapsing windpipe. The wolf went limp. But Willie wasn't done. The bloodlust had seized the wheel. He threw the dead wolf aside like a rag doll and turned on the next one, which was circling Alfred. Willie moved on all fours for a split second, a horrific scuttle, before springing upright. He backhanded the beast with his infected arm. The blow sent the wolf cartwheeling into a tree trunk with enough force to shatter its spine. The remaining wolves, sensing the shift in the hierarchy, hesitated. They looked at Willie, standing tall, chest heaving, his eyes glowing with a faint, amber luminescence in the dark, and they broke. They scattered into the woods, yipping in terror. Silence crashed back down on the clearing, heavy and absolute, save for the ragged breathing of the 3 survivors. Alfred stood leaning on his pike, wiping black blood from his face. He looked at Willie with a grim, knowing nod. "But Dana..." Willie turned to check on her. "Dana," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "You hurt." She was backed against the rock face, her pistol still raised, but it wasn't pointed at the woods. It was pointed at him. Her face was drained of color, her eyes wide with a terror that she hadn't shown even when the wolves were charging. She was looking at his hands, slick with gore. She was looking at the way he stood, hunched forward, predatory, vibrating with adrenaline. "Willie," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what did you do?" Willie looked down at himself. He saw the devastation he had wrought with his bare hands. He felt the residual thrill of the kill fading, replaced by a cold, crushing shame. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, trying to look harmless, but the image was ruined by the blood dripping from his fingertips. "I had to," he said, pleading with the monster in her eyes. "I had to stop them." Dana lowered the gun slowly, but she didn't step toward him. She stepped back. The trust that had been built over 20 years of service, of coffees at the diner and shared shifts, had fractured. She wasn't looking at Sheriff Brown anymore. She was looking at the thing that had killed him. "We need to move," Alfred interrupted, his voice cutting the tension. "The runts are gone. That means the big man knows we're knocking, and he's waiting." Willie nodded, unable to meet Dana's gaze. He picked up his rifle from the dirt. It felt light, fragile, like a toy. He turned toward the dark maw of the cave, taking the lead again. He would save her. He would save his town. But as he walked into the dark, Willie knew that even if he survived the night, he had already lost the only life that mattered. The cave smelled of old death, a thick, ammonia-heavy stench that burned the back of the throat. The beam of Dana's flashlight cut through the damp air, illuminating walls slick with moisture and limestone turned brown by years of gore. Willie Brown didn't need the light. His vision had shifted entirely now, the darkness resolving into a grayscale landscape where heat signatures bloomed in vibrant, angry reds. He could hear the drip of water from stalactites, the frantic jackrabbit rhythm of Dana's heart, and deeper in the cavern, the slow, tectonic beat of something massive. They entered a central chamber, a natural cathedral of stone. The floor was littered with bones, deer, elk, coyote, and others that looked disturbingly human. In the center of the room, rising from a throne of loose shale and debris, the Alpha waited. It didn't hide. It didn't crouch. It stood on two legs, unfolding itself like a nightmare waking up. It was colossal, easily 7.5 feet tall, dwarfing the shadows around it. Its fur was sparse and black, revealing cords of ropey muscle beneath scarred, leathery skin. But it was the face that froze the blood in Willie's veins. It was the face of a wolf, but the eyes were ancient, molten gold, and filled with a terrifying human intelligence. As it looked at them, its lips peeled back to reveal rows of yellowed sabers. It was smiling. "God Almighty," Alfred whispered, his grip tightening on the silver pike. The Alpha didn't roar. It simply stepped down from its dais, the ground vibrating with its weight. It looked past Dana, past Alfred, and locked its gaze directly on Willie. It nodded, a gesture of recognition. "Welcome home, brother." "Willie, take the shot," Dana screamed, raising her pistol. She fired. The bullet sparked off the Alpha's shoulder, tearing through fur but barely slowing it down. The beast didn't even flinch. It moved with a terrifying burst of speed, blurring across the chamber toward them. "Run," Alfred roared. He stepped in front of Willie, planting his feet and leveling the pike. The veteran hunter didn't hesitate. He thrust the weapon forward, aiming for the beast's heart. It was a perfect strike, timed with the precision of a man who had killed monsters before. But the Alpha was faster. The beast caught the shaft of the pike in one massive hand, stopping the thrust inches from its chest. Alfred's eyes went wide. For a split second, the two predators stared at each other, the old soldier and the ancient king. The Alpha snapped the steel shaft like a dry twig. With a backhand swing that looked almost casual, the beast struck Alfred. The sound was sickening, a wet crunch of breaking ribs and collapsing lung. Alfred was lifted off his feet and thrown across the cavern. He hit the stone wall with the force of a car crash and slid to the floor, his chest caved in, blood pouring from his mouth. He twitched once, his hand grasping for a machete he would never reach, and then lay still. Dana screamed, a raw, tearing sound, but Willie didn't hear her. The sight of Alfred's broken body didn't bring grief. It brought fire. The fever in Willie's blood exploded, obliterating the last vestiges of the retired sheriff. The hesitation vanished. The fear evaporated. What remained was pure, distilled rage, a primal directive that screamed kill or be killed. Willie dropped the Winchester. He didn't need it yet. He needed to hurt it. He let out a roar that tore his throat raw, a sound that harmonized with the growl of the alpha and charged. He collided with the beast in the center of the room. It was like running into a brick wall, but Willie didn't stop. He drove his shoulder into the alpha's midsection, his legs pumping, driving them both backward. The alpha, surprised by the ferocity of the assault, stumbled. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and teeth. Willie wasn't fighting like a man anymore. He was fighting like a wolf. He straddled the beast, his hands, now fully clawed talons, raking across the alpha's chest, tearing through tough hide and black fur. He felt the hot spray of blood on his face, and it tasted like victory. The alpha snarled, twisting beneath him. It brought a knee up, slamming into Willie's gut, launching him into the air. Willie landed on his feet, skidding across the bone-littered floor, panting. His shirt hung in tatters. His arms were covered in coarse black hair, the muscles rippling with supernatural power. The alpha stood, wiping black blood from its chest. It looked at Willie and its smile widened. This was what it wanted. It wanted a challenger. It wanted the wolf. It lunged. This time Willie didn't dodge. He met the charge head-on. The alpha's claws raked his back, opening deep furrows, but Willie ignored the agony. He clamped his hands onto the beast's shoulders, his thumbs digging into the muscle. They grappled jaw to jaw, breath to breath. The alpha was stronger, its weight bearing down on him, forcing Willie to his knees. "Give in," the infection whispered. "Submit." "No," Willie rasped, blood bubbling between his teeth. He didn't submit, he embraced it. He opened the floodgates to the curse, letting the monster completely consume the man. His bones creaked, shifting, hardening. With a surge of strength that defied physics, Willie head-butted the alpha. The crack of bone echoed through the cave. The alpha reeled back, stunned, its golden eyes losing focus for a fraction of a second. That was all Willie needed. He scrambled for the Winchester lying in the dirt. His clawed fingers fumbled with the lever, racking around into the chamber. The alpha shook off the daze and lunged for him, jaws gaping wide to tear out his throat. Willie didn't aim. He didn't need to. He thrust the barrel of the rifle forward like a spear. The steel barrel slammed into the alpha's chest, right between the ribs, burying itself deep into the meat. The beast roared in shock, grabbing the gun barrel, trying to wrench it free. Willie looked into those golden eyes, seeing the sudden, dawning realization of death. He saw the fear, and he smiled. Willie has the barrel pressed against the beast's chest, and he's smiling. In just a second, that silver round is going to change the history of these woods forever. But before the smoke clears, if you want to be part of the pack that survives the night, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Join us and never miss a nightmare. Now, let's see what happens when the hammer drops. "End of the line," Willie growled. He pulled the trigger. The boom was deafening in the confined space. The silver-tipped hollow point exploded inside the alpha's chest cavity, shredding the heart and blowing out the back of its spine. The light in the golden eyes flickered and died instantly. The massive weight of the creature went limp, collapsing on top of Willie, pinning him to the cold, bone-strewn floor. Willie lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the heavy scent of burnt powder and wolf blood filling his lungs, listening to the silence return to the cave. The king was dead. But as Willie looked at his own hands, trembling and stained black, he knew the war was far from over. The dust from the gunshot hung in the stagnant air of the cavern, drifting like a phantom mist through the beams of the fallen flashlights. For a long time, the only sound was the drip of water from the limestone ceiling, marking time in the dark. Then came the wet, heavy sound of shifting weight. Willie Brown shoved the carcass of the alpha aside. It rolled off him with a fleshy thud, sprawling onto the bone-littered floor. Willie sat up, his chest heaving. The air tasted of sulfur and iron. He looked down at his hands. They were coated in black blood, both his and the beast's, but beneath the gore the skin was no longer skin. It was a hide, dark and leathery, covered in the same coarse black hair that had started in the wound on his arm. His fingernails were gone, replaced by curved, serrated talons that clicked against the stone as he braced himself. "Willie!" The voice was small, trembling and terrified. Willie didn't turn immediately. He could hear Dana's heart fluttering like a trapped moth. He could smell the salt of her tears and the sharp spike of adrenaline that hadn't faded. He slowly rose to his feet. His joints popped and cracked, realigning, stretching to accommodate a frame that was now inches taller and broader than the man who had walked into the cave. He turned to face her. Dana stood near the entrance of the chamber, her pistol lowered but her grip white-knuckled. She was staring at him, her eyes tracing the ruin of his flannel shirt, the matted fur on his chest, and finally his face. Willie knew what she saw. He could feel the change in the geometry of his jaw, the ache in his gums where his teeth had crowded and sharpened. But it was his eyes that made her take a stumbling step backward. They were no longer the pale, tired blue of a retired sheriff. They were molten gold, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence that cut through the shadows. "It's done," Willie said. His voice was a ruin, a gravelly, subsonic rumble that vibrated in the hollows of the cave. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. Dana looked past him to the broken body of Alfred Johnson against the far wall. She let out a choked sob, then looked back at Willie, tears spilling down her dust-streaked cheeks. We can fix this," she stammered, the desperation in her voice breaking his heart. "We can get you to a hospital in Nashville, specialists, CDC. Someone will know what to do." Willie shook his head. The motion was fluid, too fast for a human. "There is no hospital for this, Dana, you know that." He took a step toward her. She flinched, instinctively raising the gun an inch before stopping herself. The tragedy of that small movement cut Willie deeper than any claw. He stopped, keeping his distance. "The fever is gone," he said softly, tapping his chest where the alpha had struck him. "The shaking stopped. I don't feel sick anymore, Sheriff. I feel awake." "You're still Willie Brown," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "You're still the man who taught me how to shoot. You're still my friend." "Part of me," Willie agreed. "The part that remembers coffee on the porch and the smell of rain. But that part is getting quieter, and the other part—" he looked at his clawed hands, flexing them. "The other part is hungry, and it's angry." He reached into the tattered remains of his pocket. It took a moment for his clumsy, oversized fingers to find what he was looking for. He pulled out a piece of metal, warm from his body heat. It was a silver star, tarnished with age and scratched from years of duty. His old badge. He walked forward, moving slowly so as not to spook her. He extended his hand. The badge looked tiny in his dark, scarred palm. "Take it," he said. Dana stared at the star. "Willie, don't, please." "There's a pack out there," Willie said, his golden eyes drifting toward the cave entrance. "The runners, the ones we didn't kill, they're leaderless now, confused, dangerous." He looked back at her, his expression hardening into something ancient and resolute. "They need a lawman, but not the kind that reads rights." "You can't just leave," she whispered, taking the badge with a trembling hand. "Where will you go?" Willie looked toward the deep dark of the tunnel, toward the scent of the pine woods and the night air waiting above. Deep, where the hikers don't go, where the shadows stay long. He looked at her one last time, etching her face into the human part of his memory that he would fight to keep. "Tell them Willie Brown died in this cave," he rasped. "Tell them he died fighting like a Marine. Don't let them look for me, Dana. If they come hunting, I might not be able to stop myself." "Willie." He didn't say goodbye. He simply turned. He didn't walk away, he dropped to all fours, his spine fluid and powerful. With a burst of speed that kicked up a cloud of bone dust, he launched himself into the darkness of the tunnel. He was gone before the sound of his exit faded, vanishing into the earth like a ghost. Dana stood alone in the silence, clutching the warm silver star to her chest, listening to the drip of water and the fatting echoes of a monster who had once been a good man. Months turned into years, and the seasons cycled through the land between the lakes. The official report stated that a bear attack had claimed the lives of Alfred Johnson and retired Sheriff Willie Brown during a search for a missing hiker. The caves were sealed off by the Forestry Service, marked as unstable and hazardous. The town of Golden Pond slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, the terror of that bloody autumn fading into whispered rumors and barstool tall tales. But the locals knew better. They knew because the disappearances stopped. The unexplained livestock mutilation ceased. The woods, once a place of old whispers and unease, felt different, safer. Yet there were stories. Fishermen out on the lakes at dawn would speak of a massive, dark shape moving along the tree line, something that stood on two legs like a man but moved with the loping grace of a wolf. Campers deep in the backcountry reported waking up to the sound of fighting in the distance, snarls and howls that sounded like a war between demons, only to find the carcasses of coyotes or strange, mangy wolves left near the trails the next morning, their throats torn out with surgical precision. They say if you drive the old logging roads past midnight, you might see eyes reflecting in your high beams, not the green of a deer or the red of a possum, but a burning, molten gold. Sheriff Dana Cordell never investigated these sightings. She kept the reports in a separate file in her bottom drawer, locked away. Every now and then, when the moon was full and the woods were singing, she would drive out to the edge of the old property where a rusted truck still sat in the weeds. She would sit on the hood, drinking black coffee, and watch the tree line. She never saw him, but sometimes when the wind was right she would hear it, not a howl, not a scream, but a low, rumbling bark that echoed off the water, a sound of warning to the things in the dark and a promise to the people in the light. The alpha was dead, but the sheriff was still on duty.